Good evening to you all. I welcome you once again to our virtual teaching today. Today we are going to look at a very interesting topic in the VCC level, and basically we will be looking at the scramble for and partition of Africa. The scramble for and partition of Africa, and specifically we are going to look at the reasons for the scramble and partition of Africa. The reasons for the scramble and partition of Africa. And so basically this is the topic that we are going to treat or learn about today. Now, scramble. What do we mean by the word scramble? When you check in your dictionary, you realize that scramble is when people fight or quarrel about something. So everyone wants to get access to it or access to something, and so it leads to a scramble. And then partition, when you check in your dictionary, you also realize that partition simply means to divide something into two equal parts for each and everyone to get his or hers. And so basically the idea we get is that there was a scramble for the partition of Africa. So somebody somewhere scrambled for Africa, and then which later ended in the division of Africa. So we are yet to find out which people scrambled for Africa and what were they scrambled for in Africa, and what, of course, the reasons for that scramble, and the effect that this scramble had on Africa. So basically, today we will start with the reasons for the scramble. Why did the group of people that we are about to know, which people engaged in the scramble, and why did they engage in the scramble? And so basically, this is what we are going to look at. So let's take a look at our lesson objectives as we do every day. Now, by the end of the lesson, you should be able to examine the reasons that accounted for the scramble and partition of Africa. I am sure that by now you have a fair idea about what we are going to discuss today. Why some people decided to scramble, and then later which ended in the division of Africa. So you should be able to examine all the reasons that led to the scramble and partition, which eventually led to the partition of Africa. So let's begin with our discussion. So let's introduce ourselves to the scramble and the partition of Africa. So Africa, the partition of Africa simply means, or is defined as the scramble for and division of African territories among European powers. And this occurred between 1880 and 1900. So we are saying that around this period, 1880 and 1900, which is around the 20th century, of course, getting to the tail end of the 19th century, Africa was divided among some European powers. European power simply means European countries. and it was the territories, the land in Africa that was divided among the Europeans. Now, from the last 2 decades of the 19th century, as I have indicated earlier, we realize that the political history of Africa took a dramatic turn. You know, as late as 1880, that is, before 1880, only a small portion of the continent was under direct European control. So, before 1880 or prior to 1880, it was only a small portion of the continent that was under the direct control of the European powers. And direct control here means that the Europeans had access to or had the political power on only a small section of the African continent. All right. But then, you know, a different story was, however, to be told just 30 years later. That is from 1880 to 1910. 30 years later, whilst before 1880, only a small portion of the continent was under direct European control. 30 years later, we realized that apart from Liberia and Ethiopia, which of course had not been colonized or was not under any European power, simply because Liberia was a colony, a slave colony of the Americas, and Ethiopia was also ruled by a powerful emperor Haile Selassie. So these were the two reasons why these two countries were the only countries in Africa that by 1910 had not been colonized. And by 1910, all the African countries, with the exception of these two, had been shared among European powers. So you realize that the partition came, the colonization came about as a result of the sharing of Africa among the European powers. And some of the European powers that took part in the sharing of Africa was Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Belgium. So these were some of the European countries that took part in the scramble for the lands in Africa. And eventually, that scramble led to the partition of the African land between these European powers. Take notice of the European powers that took part in the scramble. Now, the European powers scrambled for territories in Africa, and we have vivid examples where to prove that indeed the Europeans scrambled for lands in Africa. For example, in 1882, the British and the French, they scrambled over Egypt. The British and the French by 1882 were scrambling or were fighting over Egypt. They were, you know, each of them wanted to take Egypt and make it their own, mainly because of the Suez Canal, that they had wanted to control the trade around that area. Now, the Portuguese, or Portugal and Britain, also scrambled, the same Britain also scrambled over East Africa, some countries in East Africa. So what happened was that, you know, these Europeans claiming this place is for me, that place is for me, this place is for me, nearly led to a war among themselves, among the European powers, and particularly the most intense of all the rivalries or the scramble was that of the one between the French and then the Britain, and then Britain. These two countries' rivalry was the most intense. So when you are asked anywhere which two European countries, you know, rivalry for or scramble for colonies in Africa was the most intense, it was between the British and the French, and this nearly led to a war between these European powers. And therefore, what then led to the scramble? So this is basically the background to the reasons for the scramble. So let's go and look at what led to the scramble, and which eventually led to the partition. So quickly, let's look at that one. Now, before we go to the scramble, what led to the scramble of Africa? Take a look at Africa before and after the partition. So after the scrambling led to the partition, or the scrambling led to the partition. So you look at the map on your left hand side, the 1880 map, you realize that we have, this was the state of Africa, if I should say the map of Africa then in 1880. You realize that you have small territories within the states, within the states, or within the African continent. Those small territories are the civilizations that we learned about, or that we have been learning about in our previous discussion, or in year 10 or Form 1 classes. You realize that the accounts are found there where you have present day Ghana. You realize that the Dahomes are also there, the Sokoto Caliphate are also there, all the states, the Bantus, the Aksumite people, the Egyptians, they were all there like that. And so that was the map of Africa before the partition. But let's take a look at the map of Africa after the partition. Now, African colonies after the partition, or the Berlin Conference, which we shall look at as we move on in our discussion, you realize that in that partition, the demarcation has changed. That is after 1880. You realize that we have named some places. Let me see if I can zoom for you to see it properly. So let me try and zoom it. So these were so we have, these were some of the countries that live there. So we have Liberia over here. Okay, we have the Gold Coast, that is Ghana. We have the Gold Coast here. We have the Congo here. We have the Sokoto Caliphate here. Okay, then we have the Dahomey also at this place. Alright, so you realize that the various Ethiopia also there, Ethiopian Empire. So all the sultanates, you also remember the Sultanate of Zanzibar. See, so all the countries were there like that. But then a different story was told after 1880. Now take a look at this one. You see that after the partition, the British took, Ghana. So you see we have the British took this part, Ghana. They also took this part, which is Nigeria. The French took the whole of this place, whole of that. The French took here, the French took here. They also took the whole of this place where you have these colors. The French took them, and the Spanish took this small portion. Then we have the British again taking here. Okay, then we have the British over there, and Italy, Belgium taking this place. We have Germany also taking Cameroon. Germany also taking Togo over here. Okay, and we have the French taking whatever. So take a look at the map. West Africa. Which country do you think gained the most of the share or the lands in Africa? Take a look at the West African map. Just focus on West Africa. Which of the countries or which of the European powers obtained the lion's share of the territory? Of course, the answer is right there in your eye. The lion's share, or the biggest share in the partition, which country took the biggest share in West Africa? That is a question for you to look at. But somebody will ask, so why then, why the scramble? That is basically what we are going to look at. Why the scramble? So the reasons for the scramble. So quickly, let's run through the reasons that led to the scramble. So the general reasons that led to the scramble or the reasons that led to the partition. Now the scramble has already been initiated. We are looking at the partition. So the reasons that led to the partition, that is the division. We know what brought about why they were scrambling. Now what led to the partition? It's categorized into three. So the reasons for the partition is categorized into three. We have the economic, we have social, and we have the political reasons. So you could be asked to talk about only the economic reasons, only the social reasons, or only the political reasons. You could also be asked to talk about in general, give 5 reasons for the partition of Africa, so you can mix them, but you state or indicate that this is an economic reason, this is also social and political. And we are saying that the conditions that led to the partition of Africa were not found in Africa. Okay, these economic, political, and social reasons that we are going to talk about were reasons or forces that were operating in Europe during the second half of the 19th century. Okay, and so somebody will say, okay, so are these reasons here? No, the reasons that led to the partition are not found in Africa. So it was an event or things which were happening in Europe that led to the partition of Africa here. So the things that led to the partition of Africa did not take place on the African soil. Basically, that is what you should get in mind. Now let's start with the political reasons, with the economic reasons, sorry. Now, one economic reason was that led to the partition of Africa was that the Europeans wanted to find surplus market for their surplus produce. Surplus market for their surplus produce. So, which means that they had a lot of produce. Produce here will mean manufactured products. They had a lot of produce that they needed surplus market to send these surplus produce so that they could go and sell in another market, because the goods that they were able to produce, of course, was too much for their local market to absorb. Now, what brought about this surplus produce? There was an industrial revolution in Europe during the second half of the 19th century. And the Industrial Revolution was a period when the use of complicated machines came to replace the use of human hands and simple tools in the production of goods and the rendering of services. So the Industrial Revolution in European history was the period when man moved away from the use of hands in making tools. Now man adopted the use of complicated machines, in the production of goods and then the rendering of services. So now man has moved from the state where man was using his hand to make tools and all of that, as we learned in the prehistoric man. Now industries were now emerging. This was the beginning of industries. So as all the European countries were industrializing, they were all industrialized. Okay, France, Germany, Britain, Russia, Italy, they all became industrialized. And so those machines were able to produce far more, products. And we are saying that those productions far outstripped the demands of the internal market. And therefore, Europe sought for a new market to absorb the supply of manufactured goods. European states, therefore, took to the search for colonies whose market they could dominate. And so, as the machines came in, European population was not too much. The machines were able to produce more goods, and so their local market could not absorb all the goods, and therefore they needed other places to sell the surplus ones. Okay, and so they took to searching for colonies in Africa or elsewhere so that they could dominate that colony, they could make that place their colony, so that they could bring some of those surplus produce to those colonies to sell. I hope it is clear. Good. And so every one of them was scrambling for a land in Africa to dominate. Now, the second um, economic reason was that the Europeans needed raw materials to feed their local industries. So now, the Industrial Revolution, for the economic aspect, we can say the Industrial Revolution is the center of all the events that, of course, took place. What happened was that these industries that had been established needed raw materials, and in most instances, these raw materials were not found in Europe. And example of these raw materials were gold, ivory, rubber, timber, and palm oil. And the Europeans needed these raw materials to to manufacture goods. So, for example, they were using gold to manufacture jewelry, to mint coins. They were also using rubber to make tie, as car tie. They were also using ivory. They also needed ivory for musical instruments. Timber, they also used timber for home furniture, and paper, the paper that we write in. So there was a demand for raw materials to feed those industries, and that became very acute and competitive. So every European country wanted to get access to where they had, or which part of the African land that had a lot of gold. So they wanted to get access to that part of the African land that had a lot of rubber, that had a lot of ivory, that had a lot of timber, so that they could say, I am, of course, controlling this area. So all the gold that comes here should come to my country, so that they could use them, or they could use them in their industry to manufacture a lot of goods to get money. Now, the demand for raw materials, of course, as I said, however, not all these raw materials, as we have said, all these raw materials are not found in Europe. And so they hope to get a colony so that they could get, the source of supply of these raw materials, so that they can, of course, complement the little that they could obtain from the house. And so, because of raw materials, all of them again were scrambling for lands in Africa. Quickly, let's look at the third one. The Europeans also needed a place to invest their surplus capital. Because of the nature of the machines that they were producing, they could produce more, and so they made a lot of profit, because they managed to produce a lot of goods, and so they made a lot of huge profit. So as businessmen, they needed to invest those surplus profit, because they gained excess profit, to invest those surplus profit in elsewhere, so that they could get more money. And so African countries were seen as areas for the investment, or for this investment. So the agencies of the chartered companies, like the Royal Niger Company, the Imperial East African Company, and the South African Chartered Company, these companies were then instructed to do that, to come to Africa to seek for lands where they could dominate, okay, and then of course, so they can invest over there. And we normally hear our politicians say that they should come and invest in Africa. They should come and invest in Africa. So once they get their surplus capital, definitely they come to Africa to invest that surplus profit. Now, those were the three reasons, economic reasons for the scramble. Let's take a look at the social reasons that led to the partition of Africa. So the Europeans again wanted to spread the Christian faith to Africans. So they believed that it was the white man's burden to educate and civilize Africans, or less fortunate people elsewhere. And especially to them, Africa was the most less fortunate people. So they were just eager to come and civilize us. And this was done because they just wanted to, let Africans do away with some of their inhuman cultural practices, such as human sacrifices, killing of twins, that to them they believed was sinful, or even nature of how Africans, or how Africans worshipped. To them, it was evil, and therefore they needed to, of course, come and Christianize Africans in order for them to probably go to heaven. Now, again, the Europeans needed a place to settle their excess population to ease unemployment. So what happened was that with the coming in of the machines, with the coming in of the machines, you realize that the machines could do a job that about 10 people could do. If 10 people could use maybe 5 days to do a particular job, the machine could use just a day to do that job. So you realize that most of the Europeans were unemployed. They were, of course, sacked from the workplace because the machines had come to replace them, had come to do the work that they were using them to do. And so most of them were unemployed. And so what happened was that it brought about unemployment in Europe. There was hardship everywhere. And for instance, a small nation like Italy, who had high birth rate, of course, a lot of people were being born. So there were many, and they couldn't take up the whole situation. So they needed a place to settle those excess population, those who didn't have a place to stay. Like if you go to Accra today, we have a lot of excess people living in Accra. They don't have a place to stay. So then the government decides to say, okay, fine. All those in Accra that do not have a place to stay, that do not have a job, I'm taking all of you to a different land. And that is exactly what the Europeans did. They needed to settle their excess population in order to ease unemployment in Europe. So basically, this was the two most important economic social reasons that led to the partition of Africa. Now let's take a look at the last two reasons, which is the political reasons, and then we'll bring our lesson to an end. Now, politically, there was a balance of power in Europe after the Russo-Turkish War in 1887. Now, this war was fought between Russia and Turkey in 1887 to 1878, and this war created a balance of power situation in Europe. Okay, and so what happened was that none of the European countries could extend, their influence. And in the olden days, the might and prestige of a nation then depended on the number of colonies it possessed. So you realize that if you could be respected as a powerful nation in Europe, it depended on the number of colonies that you had. And since Europe, they couldn't, because French was the most powerful at that time, because French had a lot of colonies even overseas, but even in Europe. But French lost all her colonies, and therefore all of them, of course, wanted to get access to lands in Africa so that they could dominate and still be seen as powerful. Today, when you have a lot of your military might today, indicates how powerful you are as a country. But in those days, it was the number of colonies. So all the European countries wanted to find colonies in order to be seen as powerful. Again, the Europeans also needed a place where their warships could berth. So, during the First World War, the Europeans needed a strategic place where they could berth their ships, so that those places could be a commanding point. And one of those places were the Kamina wireless station in Togoland, and this served as the communication list in Germany. So in the course of the First World War, they needed a strategic place to command their armies, and they saw Africa as the most suitable place for them. And so all these reasons led to the scramble and partition of Africa. So we have some trial work there, and I hope you are going to try your hands on them as you move on. If you have any question, you can WhatsApp me 05420830047, and I will be happy to answer them for you. See you some other time. Goodbye.